Hello, my name is Akarsh Ojha from the DesignX Hackathon, and I'll be presenting the HyperX AI skill trainer for you. Before we actually answer what the product is, we have to analyze the market and ask these questions. Should HyperX expand its market for keyboards, mice, and more, or for its software? Before we actually answer this question, we have to look at what HyperX is good at. If you research online or ask anybody familiar with HyperX about what they're good at, they're going to say they're gaming headsets and earbuds as well as signature collaborative works. Due to the fact that these are very, very high in affordability and the fact that they have relatively good build quality, they are famous among gamers who use gaming headsets while they're gaming. However, HyperX's gaming market competition is quite high in terms of keyboards and mice. For example, some of its competitors include Corsair, Razer, and SteelSeries. So the questions we're going to be asking here is what can HyperX do to compete with Corsair, Razer, SteelSeries, and etc. in terms of keyboard and mice, though their headsets are very, very highly rated. So the obvious answer to this question is expand physical limitations. So with a keyboard, start introducing mechanical key switches, start changing the keycaps, and start changing the layout. Or with a mice, introduce new RGB components, or better yet, make it more ergonomic for both of these things. And the fact that a lot of these gaming companies have already taken these into account, the answer is software. So we're going to be looking at what I'm going to specifically make and explain the reasoning behind considering the HyperX AI skill trainer. In the pandemic, competitive gaming has taken a wide turn. The number of esports viewers in the United States has bumped up to 84 million in 2021, and a lot of people are focused on the aspects of competitive gaming. For example, in the bottom here, I tried to search common keywords on YouTube for a lot of competitive games. So if you search up CSGO Best, Valorant Best, Team Fortress 2 Best, or Minecraft Best, well, a lot of what you would see is best settings, best crosshair, best graphics settings, PvP tips, etc. So this shows that there is a lot of interest in the public related to competitive gaming. Additionally, esports players like Shroud, for example, did a collaborative work with Logitech which included a line of gear associated with Shroud, which not only garnered a lot of market interest, but also garnered a lot of public interest. And my goal is to essentially take this competitive world, merge it with AimLab, Aiming Pro, and other sort of aiming services that help you train to be in this competitive sphere, and use it in tandem with your keyboard and mouse instead of just your mouse or making a specific game for this. So here I will introduce what is a HyperX AI skill trainer and how it works. So HyperX skill trainer is essentially an AI trainer made to bridge the gap between the average person and the competitive person. Due to the high volume of players who are willing to be better at certain video games due to their high competitive quotient, there is an obvious bridge here that can be tapped into. Between the competitive person and the average person, I believe the main difference in deterministic competitive video games where everything is determined by your input is your keyboard and mouse input. So HyperX AI Skill Trainer is an application that will be able to not only compare the two inputs between an average person and a competitive person, but also give pointers on how to improve it using visualization. So how do you even get keystrokes and inputs? Well, for a lot of simple games like Counter-Strike, like Minecraft, or Trackmania, for example, a lot of key checker, key press, or keystrokes interfaces are already there as part of mods or as part of the console itself. For now, I'll be taking the game Trackmania, which is a deterministic competitive video game which has a lot of its roots based on getting keystrokes from the user who drives on the track. So with regards to Trackmania, you can obviously take inputs directly out of every replay file. And a replay file is essentially a replay of a specific game that is saved to your desktop. So if you have access to this file, or really anything like it, you will be able to extract its inputs. So for example, for Trackmania and in the track Nations Forever by Race Hans, a person has visualized the steering experience or the strafing A and D inputs, or left and right inputs of the car in the track. And to show how this can be compared with each other, this is the same track over 4 people's gameplays, one of which is keyboard, rest of which is on a gaming pad. So for example, you can see here that the left to right steering over time is actually shown through this graph here, and they are quite similar in certain spots. However, if you're a beginner and you have these inputs, you can obviously compare them with people who have world records, a really high competitive edge. So another question is, how does AI train someone? Simply comparing inputs may obviously help, but for certain deterministic games, it is vital to understand the difference between standard error and difference in skill. So here's how it works. The first step is to get a competitive player's inputs and get the user's inputs. So that would be done by using keyboard strokes and mouse movement over the screen, or for in Trackmania's case, just the inputs from the replay file. The step 2 is using p-significance testing to find out whether a user's inputs and the competitive player's inputs are statistically different in certain parts of the scenario, to make sure that it's not just random error that's causing a difference in these inputs. So the third step is to use machine learning and outcomes of specific parts of a scenario to classify certain inputs as game breaking or game willing, while monitoring the inputs between the casual player and the competitive player. The fourth step is obviously to use machine learning to determine specific techniques specific to the scenario. So, for example, A to D strafing, it would be called strafing and would be called out to the player, and drifting is shift and arrow keys in terms of Trackmania, which we can use to show to a casual player if they don't know how to read input visualizations. And finally, step 5 is to display it all in a UI. So, is this a difficult project or is it easy? So, is this a difficult project or is it easy? In my opinion, this is an extremely ambitious and difficult to do project, depending on the game. For example, for Trackmania, getting the input replays is quite easy, so doing that should be quite easy as well. But if you're looking at other competitive games like Valorant and Counter-Strike Global Offensive, it's very, very hard to get the inputs, and it's also extremely hard depending on what you're doing in the game, and I will explain that in a moment. However, if you have a simple deterministic game, it is viable if you spend a few years or a few months on this project. So, what are the challenges associated with this? Coders might be able to get this done, definitely. But what challenges are we presented with by taking this product into consideration? So the first challenge that we'll have is obviously accounting for RNG, and tiny input events and tiny input differences are difficult to predict, and obviously they can happen at random times in the game, basically highlighting the fact that this game isn't deterministic and your input doesn't really matter. So you have to adjust for that. But adjusting for random events is very, very difficult. So this currently only works in a deterministic scenario. Obviously the next one is privacy, because this is essentially a glorified keylogger. So extra security precautions must be taken in order to make sure that your key inputs are stored safely and key inputs don't bleed into other applications or anything else. The third one is getting pro data. Getting player data or average player data might be very, very easy since it runs on the computer, but getting a lot of pro player data may be entirely impossible or difficult depending on what you can do. So if you have a lot of pro players, like essentially 50 to 100, depending on the sample size, you will have enough inputs for specific scenarios, depending on the fact that you do multiple scenarios, but based on that, you can definitely have enough pro player data, but it may not be enough compared to the average player's data. And finally, it's hard to code. If this product is to be created, a lot of hard code and logic must be behind input predictions. So as I mentioned here, it's a very, very ambitious project. And so the semi-final part is, where would this be implemented? So the product is done, but how do we roll it out to customers and how will we integrate it to the game? If HyperX wants to develop its own application, it can, but I would recommend using something like HyperX Ingenuity or some other visualization software that can be integrated within the lighting software. So all you have to do is essentially take a lot of this input data, feed it into Ingenuity, and make a visualization program so that people can actually see their inputs and how it's affecting the game as compared to what a pro player would do. And obviously they would see these specific sections that are very, very difficult highlighted for them. So finally, what's the impact? It's out. So what will this do to HyperX and those who use the product? So obviously the obvious answer is HyperX competitive gaming market reaches average players, a lot more average players. And I know that HyperX has invested a lot into esports, however, something like this and giving the competitive edge to the average player can actually help in terms of sales. In general, people just get better at video games. So that's the impact of this thing. So that's all. Thank you so much. Thank you for looking at my pitch. If you have any questions, reach out to me on my dev post or GitHub at Akarsh Ojha. Thank you.